Hello and welcome. This is Mr. Arvidas. This is Unit 1 of AP US History. Unit 1 is only worth 5% of the AP exam. It's a very odd unit in the sense that it's the only one that really doesn't cover US history as much. It's more of a world history or Western Civ type scenario. And so the major topics in this unit really stem with Native American life prior to colonial exploration, then the Spanish incursion, 1492, Christopher Columbus, and then the aftermath of that, right? What are the effects of that incursion? And that's the creation of new economic systems, the importation of labor, right? Talking slave labor, both natives being enslaved, then of course African slavery, and of course indentured servitude. And we're also going to look at the resources that get exchanged. And this process is called the Columbian Exchange, which is probably the most important part of this. More important than all of that, though, is that this really just sets the tone for what is about to happen in U.S. history. And so this time period really covers the starting point's kind of a mystery, but it covers essentially before 1492 all the way till about 1607. That tends to be the stopping point. And so in this section, we're going to look at those things. So the first thing that I always like to do, and I think this is really important, we have to look at the Native Americans. It can be very easy to gloss over Native Americans in this course. You should not. We need to make sure we pay really good attention. It is one of the major conflicts and one of the major changes that's going to take place throughout the first half of American history is the Native American lifestyle and where Native Americans are living, how they are living, and then of course what happens to them, how they are pushed away from their lands, killed because of disease and war and everything else. And those are really important. One of the things that a lot of people, I think, make mistakes of is they try and look at Native American life as being primitive or not being advanced, and clearly that is not the case. Now, there are some technological advantages that Europeans had on the cusp of invasion, and that would be obviously gunpowder, and then, of course, their sailing ships and everything else, wheels and things of that nature. All of that was advanced. Very true. But if we look at, say, the Aztecs or the Mayans before them or the Incas in Peru, these are very complex societies. In fact, the capital in the Aztec Empire had more people than virtually any European city at that same time. In North America, when we talk about the history of the United States, we have to look at Native Americans in a regional sense because they definitely lived differently depending on the region. And so this kind of eliminates that holistic approach of talking about Native Americans in a one-size-fits-all category because it's just completely inaccurate. Native Americans who lived in, say, the Southwest, they lived in pueblos, they had varying degrees of structure and societies. If they lived in the Pacific Northwest, right, you're talking wooded areas, a lot of fishing on the Pacific coast. What they ate, what they farmed, what they did was totally different than, say, the Great Plains, who are migratory, right? They're migrating with the buffalo herds and everything else. Important to note that horses are not around yet. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget about when we think about the Native Americans and everything else, is that their life changes because of European incursion in a lot of different ways. And for the Plains natives, hunting buffalo and things of that nature on foot was the common practice. As horses get introduced by the Spanish and migrate up into the Plains area, then all of a sudden horses are going to be introduced, and it's going to change the game on how they hunt buffalo and how they live. They're going to be far more mobile than they were on foot. So I think that's an important thing to recognize. Natives who lived along the Mississippi River, obviously they farmed and had varying degrees of cultural societies and things of that nature. Here's the thing, I think, with Native American tribes that frustrates students a lot, and you might be getting frustrated with this too, is we tend to not see a lot of written sources. And because we're used to covering Western society or even Eastern society with China and everything else, we assume that everything has to be written down and there has to be literate people writing things to make a society complex. Now, in world history, you should have learned through the Mongols that that's not always the case. Sometimes peoples can be complex without having a fully written out language. But in this case with Native Americans, we don't have translations. Some of these tribes are also wiped out. But yeah, written documents tend to not be available. And I think that's something that I think frustrates a lot of students. Now, as far as Native Americans go, in terms of 1492, this is going to be a game-changing event. And I always look at it this way. 1492 is the year Christopher Columbus obviously comes across the Atlantic Ocean. And there's some of you are going to say, wait a second, he wasn't the first person to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The Vikings did. And that's true. Right around 1,000 or so, give or take, a couple of centuries, the Vikings made it across the Atlantic Ocean. They, however, did not have long-lasting settlements, and it did not have a gigantic impact. Columbus is important because his discovery, quote unquote, of the new world of the Americas had a long-lasting impact. That does not mean Columbus is an overall good person. And as a lot of you will discover as you do readings, I know in my class they have a reading the first day on Columbus, He's not exactly a good person. He's pretty horrible. So Columbus, while for Europeans, the discovery of the New World is going to symbolize a new, robust economy. I mean, you're talking when the Spanish get into Peru, they're going to be able to mine silver in Bolivia, actually. They mine silver at a huge rate. Hundreds of tons a year of silver going back and forth to Spain, so much so that it deflates or inflates the price or deflates the price of silver. And so as we look at these varying degrees, there has to be some reasons why Europeans went across the Atlantic Ocean. Because Christopher Columbus, the myth is that he all of a sudden was like, a light bulb goes off and he has a globe and he's like, look, it's round. Everyone's surprised. The idea of a round globe was scientifically already discovered. The ancient Greeks did that way back when. You had Muslims talking about it. You had people in the East talking about it. And Europeans were even talking about it. So Columbus isn't exactly like a scientist who discovered the Earth was round. I think that's another kind of a misnomer. He did, however, understand that going west would bypass certain trade routes, because when Constantinople fell, and it fell in the mid-1400s, when Constantinople fell, all of a sudden the Ottoman Empire put taxes, especially on Christian merchant ships, to trade with the East. And this is going to be one of the reasons why they're going to do that. They're going to try and bypass all of that. And as European naval technology developed throughout the 1300s and 1400s, they were able to go around the coast of Africa, which actually happens right around the same time Columbus is going across the ocean. Diaz and da Gama, right? Go look at the dates. That's right around the same time. Columbus, however, is going to go across. This is a huge risk for Spain, but it's going to pay off massive rewards. And I'm not going to get into all of his journeys. He takes 4, only 2 of which are really profitable. He lies about what he sees. He goes to Haiti, says it's full of gold and everything else. It's just not true. Columbus, above all else, when you read his own diary and varying reports about him, was a liar. And there are a lot of people who point this out. One of the first things, by the way, the Spanish did, and it is really one of the first things, is when they landed in the Bahamas, they discovered a native tribe that was living there, and they immediately enslaved that tribe. And they brought a whole bunch of them back to Spain. 80% of them or so are going to die on the boat ride back. Keep in mind, diseases from Europe are going to ravage through these natives, especially in the Caribbean, where they were even more closed off than Native Americans on the mainland. And so natives in the Caribbean began to die off in large quantities. Now, Columbus and the Spanish are going to settle, and they're going to starting colonies and everything else, and this is going to lead to more and more expansion. The church is going to get involved in this as well, and that's, I think, something really important. We get the church essentially coming in and saying, hey, go explore, and giving declarations, papal bulls that say, convert people to Christianity, take lands from non-Christians. And so Spain is going to take that to heart, okay? Now, again, if you're contextually looking at Spain in 1492, Spain is a brand new country. They've just unified. They've kicked out the Moors. And so now they're really trying to solidify themselves on the global stage. And Spain will, in the 1500s, because of silver and gold mines and sugar transportation and even tobacco, they are going to make a lot of money, and Spain becomes the wealthiest power in Europe during that century. It's not going to be until 1588 when the Spanish Armada is defeated that Spain finally sees a burden, or at least a negative, on their conquest. One thing that I know they mentioned is conquistadors. Again, this is more of a world history thing. I'm not going to get into Hernan Cortez. He took over the Aztecs largely because of disease. They got hit by a smallpox epidemic, or we think it was smallpox, but it wiped out a fourth of the population, including multiple monarchs. He comes in, uses multiple rebellions to take it over. Pizarro uses the same thing. Spanish conquest, I think, is really important. I always make world history guys look at this. Spanish conquest is different. It's a government-sponsored venture. These are military ventures. The Dutch tend to be more financial in basis. The British are more trade companies coming in, not necessarily big government spending, but the Portuguese and the Spanish tend to be fully government funded, and France is somewhere in between. The biggest thing I think that really gets accomplished from this, and this is the big takeaway in this section, is the Columbian Exchange is created. Now, the Columbian Exchange is really important because there are, and I put a graph up, right? There are lots of things that get exchanged because of this. In particular, things like potatoes, corn, other like fruits like pineapple and things of that nature, peppers, tobacco, All of these things are going to be from the Americas, and they're going to be brought to Europe. The potato alone is going to change the way Europeans farm, right? A potato is a very small crop that can grow in pretty harsh climates, and it's going to increase the food surpluses in Europe. It's really, I think, one of the most underrated things to talk about in the Columbian Exchange. On the flip side, right, they're going to send lots of things over to the Caribbean, to the Americas, including things like sugarcane, right? That's really important. Horses, beasts of burden, essentially, and then, of course, pigs. Pigs come over and multiply very, very quickly. Other things like peaches and other fruits like that. Coffee is another one that gets brought over. And so all of these things are going to change the environment. And I think that's a big thing that they look for in AP things is how does the environment change from this? Well, the environment's going to change by what they're growing. That also changes the economy. So you can tie in the environmental change with the economic change. Because they're bringing in sugarcane to the Caribbean, sugarcane is going to be grown on plantations. And so very, very quickly, the Spanish are going to start to develop a system of plantations where they're going to use native labor and then replace it, because the natives died again of disease, with slave labor. That brings in triangular trade. Triangular trade is going to be a three-way trade semi-partnership with the Americas, Europe, and Africa. Africa will supply slaves. In exchange, they will get manufactured goods, food, and other things to that nature. And we're talking more Western Africa. Again, Africa is a continent made up of multiple countries, multiple ethnic groups. Really important to remember that. African slaves are going to be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean and put into these labor markets, particularly in the Caribbean, for the sugar trade, which a lot of slaves, unfortunately, die on the way. The Middle Passage, as we'll talk about in another video, the Middle Passage is going to see roughly 30 to 40% of people die on these voyages at times, and that creates real trauma, I think. And the slave trade is nothing to scoff at. This is going to be a massive industry. It is going to be the largest economic industry in the colonial exchange going forward for the next 200 years. And so I think that's really important to understand. European indentured servants do come over as well. They're offered free land in exchange for years of work. And a lot of the English colonies are going to be filled with those indentured servants. Spanish colonies do as well. And I think that's going to be another big part that we talk about altogether. Another big change is going to be religion. In the Americas, especially from Central America on down, the Spanish and Portuguese are very Catholic, and they're going to try and convert natives wholesale. Native Americans do not all convert to Catholicism. Some of them resist actively, meaning they have revolts, which get put down. Some of them resist passively, where they accept Christian teachings, but still practice their own worships on the side. There are many accounts of this. Again, more of a world history thing than it is a U.S. history thing. But either way, those are the main kind of points, right? Unit 1 kind of ends with 1607. That's when the British are going to get into the Jamestown area. But by and large, this is an economic thing. This is also a nationalism, before nationalism was a thing kind of thing. And we see all of this kind of created. The new labor systems are really important to understand, and we'll get at that a lot more in the next couple of videos on Unit 2. So thank you. Hope you enjoyed the video. That is Unit 1 of U.S. History.